Recently I saw Beauty and the Beast live in Berlin. I went to one of the last shows, so you probably won't be able to see it if you're visiting anytime soon. But if it ever hits the road again while you're in Germany, I highly recommend it. It's really spectacular. But the whole experience was weird. The show had 2G rules. In Germany, this means that you have to be vaccinated or recovered from COVID. And though it wasn't my first time back to a theater since the pandemic began, it was weird going to a show while the numbers here continued to be higher than they've ever been before. So in a sea of precautions, watching Beauty and the Beast felt like an escape. Well, mostly. Because while I was watching the show, it was hard not to think about another pandemic that changed the world.
Scientists at the National Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta today released the results of a study which shows that the lifestyle of some male homosexuals has triggered an epidemic of a rare form of cancer.
Surprisingly few people are familiar with the Acquired Immune Deficiency Syndrome, or the acronym by which it's frequently identified, AIDS.
The beast will make off with your children. He'll come after them in the night.
The U.S. government is abandoning people with AIDS.
Demonstrators were demanding more money in the war against AIDS.
He's no monster, Gaston. You are.
He's interfering with speech right now. I don't know what whatever AIDS operation is paid. You're making the same point, George.
Plague! We are in the middle of a fucking plague! And you behave like this!
In 1989, Disney was just getting back on their feet. After Walt Disney passed in 1966, the company went through what is now referred to as their Dark Age. Their animated movies weren't doing so well, and executives were questioning if the animation department was even that important anymore. People debate when exactly the Dark Age ended, but I think one way to view it is through Who Framed Roger Rabbit. Even though it wasn't entirely animated, that movie was such a success that it hinted at something great from the company. So when The Little Mermaid was a box office smash in 1989, the Disney Renaissance officially started, beginning a new era of critical acclaim. And a lot of that was because of Howard Ashman. In a now legendary talk at the animation studio, he traced the legacies of musical theater and Disney animation, showing how they intersected.
When I was approached with an opportunity to work for Disney, period, I left it I said, what about animation? What about working in that department? That was what I really wanted to do here. Much, much more than anything really in live action. Because I'm really a musical theater person, and I do see a very, very strong connection between these two media.
His work with Alan Menken on The Little Mermaid began a return to form for the company, and also solidified the animated musical format that's still popular to this day. So after the success of Mermaid, Disney wanted to keep going. Enter Beauty and the Beast. Walt Disney had tried to adapt the French fairy tale before, but wasn't successful. So the animation studio tried picking it up again, and naturally Ashman and Menken were asked to be a part of it. What was originally just an animated film became a musical, and well, the rest is history. Beauty and the Beast was not only critically acclaimed, but it was also the first animated film to be nominated for Best Picture at the Oscars.
And here are the nominees for the Best Picture. Beauty and the Beast, Don Hahn producer.
But let's go back to the film's production. Because when Howard Ashman joined the project, there was something Disney didn't know about. He had HIV.
Do you remember how he told you?
At the Oscars for Mermaid, we're sitting there at the Governor's Ball with our statuettes, and he said, I'm really, really so happy tonight. And when we get back to New York, we got to talk. And so I fly back, and I went to his house, and he simply told me that he was sick.
While Howard Ashman was living with HIV, the US was in a dark place. During the AIDS crisis, queerphobic groups blamed queer people for the pandemic, saying they deserved it, and tearing apart society's relationship with the LGBTQ community. But the moral panic didn't just come from queerphobic groups, it also came from within the community, with many people finding it difficult to agree on how to deal with the ongoing pandemic. Existing as a gay man during this time was complicated, and as a result of this, many felt isolated and alone. And the fact that Howard Ashman had an undisclosed HIV status during the pandemic might have made things more complicated. Ashman had just found out that he had AIDS, and it was his idea, not only to make it into a musical, but also to make Beast one of the two central characters. He was cursed, and this curse had brought sorrow on all those people who loved him, and maybe there was a chance for a miracle and a way for the curse to be lifted. It was a very, very concrete thing that he was doing. Of course, there are no characters in Beauty and the Beast who are HIV positive, but meaning can be a lot more complicated than that. It's possible for there to be subtext, to be something underneath the surface. We don't have a document or a speech from Howard Ashman in which he talks about the movie being a way to talk about the AIDS crisis, but when you have multiple people who worked directly with him and his life partner talking about the parallels between Howard's work and what he was experiencing in his personal life, you realize that both can be true. Beauty and the Beast is a retelling of the original Fairytale, but it can also be an allegory for the AIDS crisis, created by an HIV-positive man. And that word is important. Allegory is often used in art to tell stories that are usually hidden below the surface. This has made it an important tool for queer people. Musicals became so queer not because they've always had explicit queer representation, but because instead the stories allowed people to express themselves in ways that they would understand, but mainstream society wouldn't. It's no surprise that The Wizard of Oz in both book and movie form has had such a profound queer impact. In the 1939 movie, a girl is swept away into a new world where all of the restrictive archetypes of her previous life are irrelevant, and she goes on a journey with newfound friends only to realize that all they needed was just to be themselves. If you want to learn more about how Allegory affects other Disney films, I made a video about Mulan that goes deeper into that. So Beauty and the Beast isn't about the AIDS crisis, but it also is. Right from the beginning of the film, we can see how Howard's HIV diagnosis might have affected the writing process. The story behind the opening song Belle is that Howard Ashman was HIV positive and wasn't telling anybody. He had been very quiet. And here we had written this crazy 7-minute opening number that was much more ambitious than anybody had asked for, and I remember his fear about everything in that moment. I remember Howard was very, very reluctant to send it out, thinking that we were going to be laughed at. He delayed sending it for 2 days. Finally, of course, we sent it, and Disney loved it. Of course, Howard's HIV diagnosis wasn't the reason why they wrote a 7-minute opening number, but it's interesting to see Alan Menken talk about how the diagnosis was affecting Howard Ashman's emotional state while writing the songs. But aside from that anecdote, the opening song shows one of the film's potential connections to queerness. Look, there she goes, the girl is strange but special, a most peculiar mademoiselle. It's pity and a sin, she doesn't quite fit in. Belle is an outsider and is not accepted by society. The bookshop owner encourages her interest in reading, and some of the other people think she's beautiful, but the whole point of the opening song is to show that she is not accepted. Everyone wants her to not be herself, but instead fit the role that they want her to fit. This also becomes apparent when Gaston comes in, wanting to marry her not because he loves her for who she is, but because she's the prettiest girl in town, and he supposedly deserves the best. Gaston's need to control Belle sets the scene for her to gradually fall in love with the Beast. Though both Gaston and the Beast have moments where they deny Belle her agency, the Beast appears to genuinely learn and change. This change is what makes Belle see him in a different light. There's something sweet and almost kind, but he was mean and he was coarse and unrefined, and now he's dear and so unsure. I wonder why I didn't see it there before. When talking about the movie and queerness, the most common thing I see is people talking about Belle and the Beast. They're both outsiders, and since Howard Ashman was a driving force behind making the Beast a main character as well, it's easy to see how him being viewed as a monster but becoming compassionate while falling in love with Belle might draw parallels to how queer people were often demonized during the AIDS crisis, despite being compassionate, loving people. And when viewed that way, it's a touching story about two outsiders who defy society's expectations through love. But they have to fight for their love. And specifically, they have to fight Gaston and the people standing behind him. And that's a very important part of this movie being an allegory. I've talked about Gaston before in my video about his villain song, but what's important to know here is that he was also very queer-coded. Not only did Bill Condon share that Howard Ashman and Alan Menken based the character off of gay, masculine, rough trade stereotypes, but the song itself sounds like a gay glorification of masculinity. And let's not forget the lines removed from the original film but later restored in the 2017 remake. Lines that Alan Menken said were originally taken out because they were too edgy and adult. When I hunt, I sneak up with my quiver, and beasts of the field say a prayer. First I carefully aim for the liver, then I shoot from behind. Is that fair? I don't care. There were also a few things about the character that I didn't mention in my previous video that help give more context. Gaston's supervising animator was Andreas Deja, who happens to be an openly gay man who has said that his characterization of Gaston was based off of guys from a West Hollywood gym he frequented. He's also said that Don Hahn, the producer for the film, bought him a year-long subscription to Muscle and Fitness magazine while they were working on the movie. In addition to this, the model for Gaston was Greg Drillette, a background painter for the film who was also openly gay. And though I'm focusing on the original 1991 movie, I want to reiterate that Bill Condon, a gay man, directed the 2017 remake, and Luke Evans, also an openly gay man, played Gaston. So multiple people all involved with the character were specifically modeling him after queer aesthetics. But then why is he the villain? In the Disney Plus documentary Howard, Bill Lauk, Ashman's partner, highlights the mob song as a specific framing of the story as an AIDS crisis allegory.
To me, the mob song in Beauty and the Beast is trying to just imbue some point of view through a very subtle way. The mob song is a perfect manifestation of people seeking a scapegoat.
So why is Gaston leading the mob? Shouldn't all of the queer-coded characters be on the same side? Not exactly. And that's what makes Beauty and the Beast so complicated. When I see people talk about the film and its role as an AIDS allegory, Gaston is often left out, probably because his inclusion ruins the straightforward us versus them outsiders narrative. But I think including Gaston not only makes sense, but it also creates a more accurate depiction of what actually happened during the AIDS crisis. I feel like there's a sort of collective amnesia that happens when talking about the AIDS crisis, especially among younger people who didn't live through it. And at the ripe age of 26, I definitely consider myself part of that group. While growing up, the discussion among young people about the AIDS crisis was mainly that it was a huge loss and that we don't have a connection with queer elders because of it. But since then, I've also seen the same people who said that not wanting to give anyone over the age of 40 the time of day at queer bars, almost as if their presence, regardless of their intent, was some type of intrusion. It's not uncommon today that I see those sentiments back to back, and that makes me wonder if some people's understanding of the AIDS crisis is some type of shield. Yes, a lot of queer elders are not here anymore because of the AIDS crisis. However, to act like there aren't many who are still alive and instead create this communal divide can be convenient, because it allows us to ignore the fact that the AIDS crisis never really ended, and that queer people are still affected by it to this day. But let's look to Larry Kramer. In 1978, he published his book, which was a harsh critique of gay culture of the time. The book talks very graphically about sex, drugs, and the party culture of the gay scene, choosing not to look at it as freedom, but self-destruction. The book was very controversial, and upon release it was banned at the only gay bookstore of the time in Manhattan. Kramer was obviously very cynical about the community, and a lot of the backlash against the book was because a lot of people viewed Kramer's arguments as being not much different than homophobic ones of the time. Gay lifestyles were supposedly hedonistic and decadent to a fault. But it's important to note that as a gay man, Kramer was obviously not the same as anti-gay groups. He wanted gay people to fight for their future and didn't see partying as a productive political strategy to doing so. And at its worst, to him it represented a culture of people who have been unjustly harmed by society, and instead of fighting back, were embracing self-destruction. And when the AIDS crisis went into full swing a few years later, people started to see Kramer's criticism in a new light. And when he was one of the founding members of the important AIDS activist group ACT UP in 1987, he continued not holding back what he thought.
You're the one who's interfering with speech right now.
I don't get the GMAC or whatever AIDS pimp operation is paying you.
You're making the same point George Bush...
Plague! We are in the middle of a fucking plague! And you behave like this!
Now, I don't want to put Kramer on a pedestal. I don't agree with everything he said. But I don't think his criticism of the community should just be written off as hatred. If he didn't care about queer people, he wouldn't have been a big part of one of the most influential AIDS activism organizations fighting for queer rights. He was very direct about which behaviors and trends he thought were perpetuating the crisis, but more importantly, he was very adamant about placing blame on the government officials who discriminated against and actively suppressed queer voices of the time. And while that was happening, he believed that queer people had an obligation to work towards a solution, instead of doing what he viewed as nihilistic behavior. And he held that opinion for the rest of his life.
I'm very, very sad about all the things that I write about. I'm very sad about the gay population. I don't call it a community because I don't think we're a community. Community's too limiting a word.
Queer people not agreeing about things isn't anything new, and Larry Kramer's criticism wasn't the only controversial thing to come out of the queer community of the time. And as you might imagine, his criticisms were mainly directed at gay men. There are plenty of other examples of infighting regarding the AIDS crisis. Even today, the essential role of lesbians in AIDS activism is sometimes ignored by narratives that focus on gay men. And there are also issues of racism and transphobia that significantly change how people were and are affected by the AIDS pandemic. And Larry Kramer's activism didn't represent everyone. One thing that I do recall from that conversation was there was a real gap between who was actually in ACT UP and how ACT UP was being represented. There were people of color in ACT UP. There were women in ACT UP. In fact, there were 4 Latino committees in ACT UP, which people don't realize. There were a lot of women in leadership, yet at the time, every time the media covered ACT UP, you saw white males. So in this 1990 conversation, I said, well, Larry, what if the next time the media contacts you, you pass them on to a woman or a person of color in ACT UP? And he said, but Sarah, shouldn't we use our best people? We never really agreed. And one thing about Larry is that he never really changed his bias, his white male bias, over time. Even to this day, moralistic views on HIV status have resulted in people being incarcerated in countries like the US and Canada, with many queer people also supporting these policies. And speaking of infighting, plenty of people leave comments on my videos about my usage of the word queer, saying that reclaiming words is impossible, and that I should just say gay instead. I do say that, but don't you know that that is also a reclaimed word? And even then, it had a resurgence as a slur while I was growing up, so much so that it took me a while to use gay to describe myself because of shame. But I understand that some people view queer the same way. At the end of the day though, I think queer and queerness are helpful tools to describe deviation from cisgender heteronormative attitudes throughout history that might not always be linked with an explicit identity in the modern sense. But disagreement like that is fine with me. We all have unique experiences that affect the way we see the world. So let's talk about that instead of vilifying each other. The more I learn about LGBTQ history though, I know that's easier said than done. But back to the AIDS crisis. Not everyone agreed on how to survive the plague. And while some were participating in protests and forcing society to come to terms with the gruesome things that were taking place, others hit the gym. In a world where queer people, in this situation often gay men, were stereotyped as weak and diseased, having ripped muscles was a way to combat stereotypes. Some of these people were activists, but some were also ashamed of the community and didn't want to be associated with it. Which brings us back to Gaston, because when he targets the Beast, that's all I can think about.
The Beast will make off with your children! He'll come after them in the night!
No!
Unfortunately, there aren't any quotes that I'm aware of that talk about the dynamic between Gaston and the Beast in terms of an AIDS allegory. And without any evidence like that, I'm not going to say that there was any intent there. But given what we do know about the Beast and Gaston, and also what was happening during the AIDS crisis, I find it interesting to think about it that way.
What's the matter, Beast? Too kind and gentle to fight back?
So, as you can see, the AIDS crisis was much more complicated than just a huge loss. It was a complete moment of moral upheaval for the queer community, both internally and externally. ACT UP and other organizations were very successful in bringing awareness and putting radical queer politics in a mainstream spotlight. But the AIDS crisis was a huge loss, and no matter how much I read and how much I listen to friends tell me about how it was, from my perspective, it's a type of loss that I'll never be able to truly comprehend. The period from 1981 through 1995 was like living through a war, with unthinkable casualties and no end in sight. Something was wrong with the universe. I felt it strongly in my gut. It cropped up in dreams before I knew it was to come. And then the avalanche hit. Directors, writers, producers, designers, choreographers, musicians. And those of us who knew and loved Howard said to ourselves, but please, not Howard. And he would reassure us all that he was fine, and we all happily believed him. People with AIDS in the 1980s United States were not just fighting for their rights, they were fighting to live. When faced with a pandemic that was ignored and perpetuated by a government who did not want to help out until it was far too late, a better world couldn't be negotiated. It had to be demanded. But like a lot of stories in LGBTQ history, the goal isn't just progress, but equality. To be treated like humans, to have dignity. And this is why I don't know if I would compare it to the ongoing coronavirus pandemic. I've seen some people talk about how going through a pandemic helps them understand the AIDS crisis more, and I just don't agree. Aside from conspiracy theorists, there isn't as much of a villain with the corona pandemic as there was with the AIDS crisis. If anything, the incredibly quick response that this pandemic got does not compare to the many years of activism required to spread awareness in the 80s. So, no, you don't understand. I don't understand. But that's okay. We don't have to understand. We just have to listen and empathize. And that begins with connecting with older queer people and hearing about their experiences. The AIDS crisis took a lot of people, but people are mourning a generation that isn't gone. And we can create a community again if we want to. Another interesting example of Howard Ashman's work having allegory is the deleted song Humiliate the Boy from Aladdin. While Howard was getting sicker and sicker, he wrote the song in which Jafar strips Aladdin of all of his possessions and weakens him, both emotionally and physically. And those in the studio had a strong reaction to it.
And it's a gleeful doo-doo-doo-doo, and one by one, we're taking everything away from Aladdin. And all of us, I think, recognized that there was a pretty strong subtext to this.
The way that Ashman's collaborators saw him in the lyrics of that song reminds me of another song from Beauty and the Beast, Human Again. Cut from the original film, it was later included in extended versions, and it was also used in the stage shows. The enchanted objects sing about how much they want to be human again and what they'll do when Belle breaks the spell. It's a beautiful, touching song, and it brings out the optimism that I feel when I listen to Howard Ashman's lyrics. His work expresses so much of what it means to be human, to dream, and to grow. The fact that he was getting sicker and sicker while working on this breaks my heart. When we're human again, only human again, when the girl finally sets us all free, cheeks are blooming again, we're assuming again, we'll resume our long-lost joie de vivre. Meaning can be complicated. Like I've said, none of the characters in Beauty and the Beast have HIV or AIDS-related complications. Nor are there any letters or quotes that I know of where Howard Ashman said his work on the movie was explicitly him expressing himself as a gay man. However, to have so many close collaborators and even his life partner talk about parallels between his personal life and music gives us context. But talking about Howard Ashman's music in relation to the AIDS crisis wouldn't be complete without mentioning Sheridan Square. It was a one-off song he wrote with Menken that wasn't for a show. Instead, it was an explicit expression of how he felt with a backdrop of Sheridan Square, an important landmark in New York City's gay scene right near the Stonewall Inn. Some of the boys have panic, but none of the boys leave town. They say we're on the good ship Titanic, we're gonna sing till the boat goes down. And if it ended before it started, well, no one told us that life is fair. And why is it still so quiet tonight on Sheridan Square? Watching Beauty and the Beast during the pandemic was a surreal experience, but it was also a touching one. One of my early videos on this channel was about Howard Ashman and the unique queerness of his songs. In it, I talked about how his work has been there for me over the years, and specifically how The Little Mermaid helped me understand my queerness growing up. Part of Your World let me express longing, queerness, and hope before I even had the words gay or non-binary. Just like Belle, Ariel was othered by society and wasn't even allowed to be herself. So she had to find her own path to acceptance. As I grow older, though, I appreciate more the queer coding in Beauty and the Beast, the AIDS crisis allegory that it represents, and the complicated dynamic between Gaston and the Beast. I grew up in a queerphobic, conservative environment, and for me, seeking out other queer people and learning to embrace myself were important ways to fight back and live a more authentic life. Because of this, though, I thought that everyone who was queer had the same morals and goals as me. I thought that being queer meant that you were a good person. I now know that isn't the case. The more I learn about history, the more I ask myself, when have queer people ever agreed on anything? Disagreements and judgment within the queer community were there before the AIDS crisis, and they're still here today. And they're not always inherently against what heteronormative society thinks. For example, I'm 26 and my husband is 60. We met when I was 22 and he was 56, and I was the one who asked him to marry me. We share a love that's nothing but respectful and equal, but I've seen people from inside and outside of the queer community imply that our age difference makes our marriage inherently harmful and wrong, as if we aren't two consenting adults who can make our own decisions. And honestly, I'm not as hurt anymore when I hear horrible things from queerphobic people, because I just expect that. But it does make me sad to see fellow queer people use the same talking points. It doesn't make me feel welcome in my own community. This type of complicated infighting where people of the same community share such different goals reminds me of why the AIDS crisis was so traumatizing. But I can only imagine what that was really... Well, actually, fuck that. I literally can't imagine how that must have been. Not only was the queer community simultaneously mocked and demonized, despite being the victims, there was so much fighting from within. So much confusion as to where to put all of this hurt, all of this unjust, horrific, and unpredictable loss. When I watch Beauty and the Beast now, I see a film with hatred, with conflict, and with love. And when Belle and the Beast have their dance sequence, I see that despite all of the conflict, two people from two completely different settings can come together and persevere. And it doesn't matter who they are. All that matters is their love. But Howard Ashman didn't live to see the final film. On March 14, 1991, he died of heart failure due to AIDS-related complications. And when the film was premiered later that year, there was a dedication card for him. To our friend Howard, who gave a mermaid her voice and a beast his soul, we will be forever grateful. Howard Ashman's partner Bill Lauk would also accept an Oscar on his behalf, marking an important moment of mainstream recognition of the LGBTQ community and a dedication to a man gone too soon.
Howard and I shared a home and a life together, and I'm very happy and very proud to accept this for him. But it is bittersweet. This is the first Academy Award given to someone we've lost to AIDS. In working on Beauty and the Beast, Howard faced incredible personal challenges, but always gave his best. And what made that possible was an atmosphere of understanding, love, and support. That's something everyone facing AIDS not only needs, but deserves.
On August 12, 2019, John and I got married at New York City Hall, just 2 miles away from St. Vincent's Hospital, where Howard Ashman passed away. As we were driving up the West Side Highway later that day, I played the demo version of Beauty and the Beast, where Howard Ashman is singing, and I remember just starting to sob. It hit me all at once. All of the fighting, all of the people who came before us, it paved the way. And because of people who were so insistent, queer, and beautiful, we were able to play a small role in a larger legacy of people taking their place, showing up in pink suits because why the hell not? People who are just having fun with it and spreading love. But not everyone had that opportunity. And for many, what we were able to do could only be a dream. When we forget our queer history, we leave behind all the people who didn't forget us. The people who pushed for a more accepting society where one can live more openly than ever before. And those are the connections we have to keep building. By reaching back and making sure that we tell history accurately, we can maintain bonds with those who came before us and help set a template for those who will come after us. Not much is guaranteed, but we can always have each other. So I'll say it again. Thank you, Howard Ashman. This time, true as it can be, barely even friends, then somebody bends unexpectedly. Just a little change. Small to say the least, both a little scared, neither one prepared. Beauty and the Beast. Ever just the same, ever a surprise, ever as before, ever just as sure as the sun will rise. Tale as old as time, tune as old as song, bittersweet and strange, finding you can change, learning you were wrong, certain as the sun, rising in the east, tale as old as time, song as old as rhyme. Beauty and the Beast. Tale as old as time, song as old as rhyme. Beauty and the Beast.